Okay, so welcome everybody. My name's Eva Watkinson. I'm the head of campaigns at Debt Justice, based in the UK. Just a bit of housekeeping first of all. We have interpretation online. So if you'd like interpretation in French, Spanish or Arabic, my colleague can give you a QR code and then you can log into the session online to hear the translation. So yeah, see my colleague Pang if you would like to get translation into any of those languages. So yeah, this is, I guess, we brought together this group of organizations, which is quite a big group of organizations. So the COP28 Coalition, us, Debt Justice, Eurodad, Demand Climate Justice, Debt for Climate, to talk to kind of lead this session on the links between debt and climate change. And that is because we are in kind of an unprecedented debt crisis at the moment, really. There's 54 countries in crisis, and the links, the links between the debt and the climate crisis mean that really you can't tackle or begin to address the climate crisis in many countries without also looking at the debt crisis. So that is the topic that we're going to go through today, and we have a fantastic panel of speakers for you. So we have May Buenaventura from the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development. We have Collins Lico from ESCR. We have Rauf Ben Hamid from Debt for Climate, and we have Liddy Nakpil representing the COP28 Coalition. So we're going to really get into these issues and hopefully build our understanding and build our knowledge so that we can really take action and campaign for the debt cancellation that we need and campaign for climate justice. So welcome, and I hope you enjoy the session. Thank you. And I'll pass first to our first speaker, May.
Hi, so good morning, everyone. Just laying out what Eva mentioned as the unprecedented debt crisis. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this situation, and that remains so. We have now, the last time I looked was that there's 9.3 trillion in external debt as of 2021 among lower and middle income countries. And of these, almost 4 trillion is the public and publicly guaranteed external debt outstanding. So if we look at the profile, there's really this significant exposure to private creditors, which is of course complex issue, that a big challenge that we're facing right now. And as you know, they have really consistently refused to participate in any debt relief efforts, and also the solutions, of course, no one is complying with that, the private lenders. And so if you also look at the debt service, this is also of course in the trillions of dollars, and more than $1.2 trillion was noted as debt service paid by lower and middle income countries as of 2021. The alarming thing is that studies have shown, or those who are monitoring this, that the poorest countries are spending more on debt service than what they are actually receiving. So even in terms of not only in finance but also in aid, that the debt service outweighed total foreign aid for several countries, among which are countries in my region, such as Myanmar and Lao People's Democratic Republic. And as we see inflation rates rise, as we see the escalation of food and fuel prices, and the intensification of climate change, we can be sure, we are certain that the situation will go worse. So we are facing this twin ticking time bombs that for some countries it has already actually exploded, and others are already nearing that point of just falling off the brink. And I take the example of Pakistan. As you know, it suffered this historic flooding in 2022, and that of course the situation doesn't resolve itself quickly, no? So 33 million people are estimated to have been affected, and costs of estimated at more than 40 billion worth of damage. Yet Pakistan counts among the global south countries with the least global recorded emissions of 0.3, and yet they are bearing the harshest impacts of the climate crisis. At the same time, under these very dire situations, they are being asked to pay debt service. No? So in 2022 alone, they had to shell out 20 billion in debt payments falling due that year. This according to debt justice calculations. And at the same time, they are being penalized through IMF surcharges. These are the fees that the IMF levies on countries that borrow more than their quota and do not pay on time. So that's about 142 million in surcharges. So, and then looking at the official reports of the climate finance that is provided, up to 71% are in the form of loans. So this creates a great deal of pressure on global South governments, which are of course also complicit in this arrangement. And we see them turning more and more to extractive activities, no? In order to raise the revenues for servicing the debt, and also to welcoming climate creating solutions even, because as we've mentioned many times, when you become so dependent on debt that closing the lending windows is what you want, these countries want to avoid. No? So more revenues are also imposed to meet debt service and to be able to borrow again. One of the most harshest impacts are, of course, on women because of the budget cuts in social services, which are often the first to be reduced in times of crisis. And of course, this contributes to further lengthening of women's already long hours of unpaid work and continuing that assumption, neoliberal assumption that women will just take up the slack when social services are no longer available or affordable. Also, we see because of the unmet obligations of the rich countries, which the G7 governments to provide or to deliver the climate finance for climate action, and this of course contributes to the pressure. So this is really what we know, what we've called as a vicious cycle. That at the same time that you're suffering these, that the global South is suffering these difficulties, they're also being asked to service the debt. So it's an impossible situation, and a lot of rights are compromised or just done away with. So it even makes the situation even worse for global South countries. And all this time, there's been no recognition, even by the World Bank, of how the loans that they provided for fossil fuel projects have exacerbated the climate crisis. There's no recognition, although the IMF has famously said, we don't do structural adjustment anymore. Still, we see those. And of course, even the continuing impacts of the privatizations of decades before, that the impact has not stopped. And we now have this very vulnerable situation where people have no access to water, as we've seen during the time of the pandemic, where hand washing was impossible for even some communities that did not have access to water because the water systems had already been privatized. So what we've called here and in our campaigns is that there's a debt that is owed to us for the destruction of our planet, for the industrialization until today, which has only been made possible because of colonial and neo-colonial power relations, relations of pillage and plunder. And that's what I have my share, reparations. That's why we demand reparations, a demand which should lead to deeper and profound systemic changes down the road. We cannot accept anymore that we are sinking deeper and deeper into the debt and climate trap, while banks, corporations, and financial institutions profit even more. And we also need to expose the false solutions being offered out there, both in debt and climate. And I will just mention perhaps this vigorous promotion of mechanisms like debt swaps, which, as we've seen in the case of the Ecuador debt swap and debt swaps in the past, how they've legitimized debts that would have been argued as illegitimate debts, how they imposed new conditionalities and inflicted a host of other rights. So solutions like these need to be question. And of course, the common framework is still very much in the picture, which hasn't really, the opposite of what the IMF claims as a timely and practical solution to the problem. So I guess I'll stop there, and I'm sure my colleagues can add some more data, especially on the climate front. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Next thing we're going to hear from Collins from ESCR.
Thank you. And thank you so much, May, for setting us up to have this conversation. I'll just add to what you said. I was reading yesterday just to understand the issue of the climate crisis as well as the debt crisis. And I realized that the climate crisis actually started in the 1800s, not something that started yesterday. The debt crisis has been with us for decades. And we live in a society that is always procrastinating issue. Like we say, we will do this and we don't do it. I also understood that many of these issues are very much entrenched in colonial and imperial legacies. And so there are those who benefit from the crises as they are. The climate crisis, there are those who benefit from it. The debt crisis is a business that people are now benefiting from. So the unfortunate part of it is that both the debt crisis and the climate crisis are now a threat to the very existence of humanity, because our lives are in danger. When you look at how the climate crisis has been manifesting, I think May has mentioned the floods in Pakistan. There is a lot that is happening for those of us who are coming from Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. There is a lot that is happening. Food sovereignty, food security is a problem. Very many communities are struggling. The weather patterns have shifted. We no longer know when are we supposed to do farming, when are we supposed to plant what. So it's now a threat to our very own existence. I think that both the debt and the climate crisis are a very serious threat to the right to health, the right to life, because when you have a government that is, have no resources to be able to invest in social programs, in social protection, as well as in offering services that are fundamental to the existence of humanity, then that is a big problem. We've left all basic services, social services to the market, because governments are now focusing more on having to repay debts other than focusing on human rights, as well as addressing the impacts of the climate crisis. And I think that it's no longer a rhetoric. We are no longer supposed to be talking about the climate and debt just as crises. I think these are now, in my view, threats that if you do not in a way move faster in terms of addressing them, then we are going to start losing more lives as a result of their impacts. In my country, Kenya, just the other day, we had the climate summit. And ideally, the African Climate Summit was about financing. It was about pushing the North, provide funds for the South to be able to manage the impacts of the climate crisis. But even that being said, I think May has alluded to what some people are now calling fake solutions, because on one end, last year we celebrated quite a lot when the Loss and Damage Fund was actually created. Little did we know that it was a trap in its own existence, because when you create the fund on one end and say we want to provide African governments with enough resources to be able to quickly move in terms of addressing, perhaps mitigating and helping people to adapt to the impact of the climate change. But on the other hand, you are still financing heavy projects on fossil fuels. You are giving us with one hand, but taking with the other hand. So that is counterproductive. In any way, the status quo as much. Debts have pushed so many countries to the brink, to the extent that we are now focusing more on repayment of debts, as opposed to investing in social protection programs and perhaps projects that would help us deal with the shocks, environmental shocks, economic shocks, as well as other social vulnerabilities that many of our communities are facing. It is very unfortunate that even with governments now having shrunk fiscal spaces, they can no longer raise enough resources locally to be able to invest in programs that could, alleviate the suffering of humanity. The IMF and other institutions have now come up with very stringent measures. People could call it austerity measures. We've seen a lot of reduction in public spending. We've seen a lot of introduction of what I would call very regressive taxes and other conditionalities that are not very, very consistent with human rights. All this in the name of, securing governments to be able to raise resources to pay loans and not necessarily focus on addressing the impacts of some of these crises. The debt crisis is even worse. In my country, now we are paying what we collect every day, 60% goes to repayment of debt. And that is just Kenya. And I know that as I was looking at some data this morning, the IMF, has gone a step further to say, there are even indicators. This is a country that has a low risk. This one has a moderate risk. This one has a high risk. But when you hear that 54 countries are in debt distress, meaning that they can no longer raise funds locally to deal with their own issues. They cannot invest more fundamentally in critical basic services to be able to provide, to deal with human rights issues, then there is a big problem. So I feel that if we do not move fast, and I think this is a conversation that we've had for some time, but I think we need to move a notch higher in terms of, so how do we address some of these issues? In our own analysis with some members at ESRNet, we came to the conclusion that some of these debts, as May said, are actually illegitimate. When the colonial masters were borrowing some of these funds to sustain their colonies as well as, run their empires, some of us were not even born. So why we are being asked to pay these debts today is something that we do not understand. It is not our problem. More so, these debts were borrowed to violate our rights. We are people who stand for human rights, and therefore we are not going to allow ourselves to again pay for violations that were committed by someone else. So as May said, I think we need to perhaps think through in terms of how do we come together to push back on some of these, very draconian policies, as well as advances by some of these institutions, which I feel are very, very much imperialist, and in a way, they do not necessarily center or ground human rights as something that is very fundamental in terms of us moving forward, but rather the interest of the corporate world is at the heart of everything. And that brings me to the point around, debt and corporate capital, where corporations that actually contribute the largest greenhouse gases are not in any way going to rescind anytime soon. And in otherwise, they are actually helping governments to even deepen the debt crisis, because they sit at the table when governments are making decisions around borrowing, investments, and they are kind of have captured the political space as well as very fundamental government institutions. So for those of us who are citizens, we have no voice in deciding what happens in our countries, but to sit back and watch. Yesterday, as we had conversations here, I liked what many of us said. One, why don't we build movements that share the same analysis and then begin to advance this as global issues and not country issues, because these issues are facing all of us at the same time. So how do we, as a collective, confront these issues, from a point of understanding that all of us are sharing the same problems? And perhaps the last thing I would like to mention is in relation to the private actors, the private creditors. I think that the fact that they cannot participate in conversations around debt, around debt forgiveness, around debt restructuring, for me is a bit of a problem, because in many of the countries still, in my country, it's not that we just owe the IMF, we owe other private creditors a lot of money. And the fact that they say, hey, we only have these bilateral agreements and contracts with Kenya, we can no longer discuss this with anyone else, it's very worrying. In a country that now is in a debt crisis as we speak today. Life has become so difficult, so unbearable in an economy that is 80% informal, where not everyone is employed in the formal employment. It's very, very dangerous. It's very, very inhuman. And if I look at Kenya, there's no difference. Kenya is doing much better in terms of, the economy. That's what they tell us, compared to other African countries, especially our neighbors. So if that is the situation in my country, I wonder how it looks like in other countries as we speak today. Yeah, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's brilliant points. Roif, I'm going to hand over to you next. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you for everyone who's involved about the action and about debt and about climate change, because it's really important to have a lot of people talking about our issue and our everything. We in Debt for Climate, we are talking for debt cancellation, like we are very clear, direct, talking and asking and demanding and fighting for debt cancellation. And it's not a kind of forgiveness, of a kind of envy, of asking for something to give it to us. It's right. Because after years and years of colonialism, after years and years of slavery, and after years and years of stealing from the global South land, their debt are more and more bigger than ours. So asking for debt cancellation is right. It's something that we have to fight for. And today we are like in a workshop, about building a global front for debt. We understand very well how the system works. Like we are in the system who is fighting us and trying to find all the ways how to make money and more money without caring about anything. They are ready to kill everybody to make more money. And we are seeing that with all the climate change happening, and they're not trying even to stop a little bit. So we are in a war against them. And it's this kind of war with no ethics. They don't respect anything. They are ready to do everything. So it became like a war for life. If we fight now, if we fight today, or we're gonna die all. And we believe that we can't change anything alone. No one is strong enough to change anything alone against this system that have all the power. Like they have everything, they have governments, they have like all the rules and making all the rules to stay in power. So the question is how and what we need to do. And at least we need to be together. For us in Debt for Climate, we see that the debt is the point how to make the system weak, because it's the point how the system works. It's the point how they change from the direct colonialism to the indirect colonialism, because they were able to be in the land, to colonize, to fight. Now with all the agreement we have, they're not able, so they make the debt. And it's not something new. Like Thomas Jefferson made the indigenous people gave their land because of debt. And it's not something new, how the system used the debt to colonize people. So we see that, and it's really clear that it's all about the debt. And to attack the system in that point, like we need the debt cancellation. In Debt for Climate, we are building like a mass. We are building the movement to be together in 2025, because we believe it's a year that we can make some victory. Like it's a jubilee year. So we believe that we will find a lot of people fighting and asking for debt cancellation. And we believe that it can be a chance for us to use it, because we are ready to use everything against them to win our wars. So it can be possible to use this to achieve at least some victory. Also, 2025, it will be like the COP will be in Brazil. We will be talking about protecting Amazonia and Congo Basin. And yes, we are asking for our comrades to be with us. It's a fight for life. So we are not able to do it alone, not just we as Debt for Climate, but I'm also talking about all the climate movement We need to be together, all the progressive movement and all the progressive government that we have, at least, to build something, because the system is not only like attacking and making climate change effect, but also like we see the problems of workers, and we need like all the social rights, all the economic social rights to be together, unite to fight, because we have the same enemy. When we see that they are just making money, for example, we say that if someone have a private school and they are in the parliament, they make the financement for like for study or for the healthcare go down, so people have to go to the private sector, and they're pushing us toward the privatization. So now they are killing us from all the ways. So like it's now or never. And that's why we are here today in this workshop, because we're working and we're asking to build a big front, calling for debt cancellation, calling for climate justice, and to fight together, because we need to be together. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Cool, thank you. I'm just going to hand over to Liddy now, and then we'll have time for a short Q&A after that.
First, looking at the faces in the room, I acknowledge any colleagues here who have been in the debt fight for decades. Shepherd. He was very young when we first met. For instance, Shetel, or even Yolanda and many other colleagues in the room. And we have been in this fight for literally decades. And so we've gone through a lot. We've won.
The French interpretation is coming over on the English.
And I think one of the important opportunities we have today in terms of strengthening our calls and fights on the debt, which, you know, in Chinese, the character for crisis is also the same character for opportunity, is the climate crisis, because the climate crisis really underscores the urgency for the call for debt cancellation, as our colleague has already explained. But it's not just, I think, the call for debt cancellation. Some of the colleagues in the room have been with us for a long time, raising the issue of illegitimate debt. So this is also an opportunity to remind the world that this is not only because the South is having such a terribly difficult time paying for debts, most of which we did not benefit from, but that because many of these debts are actually illegitimate debt. And one of the best ways to illustrate this, when we say it's illegitimate debt, one key component or feature of this is that these debts have funded harmful projects and harmful policies. And one of the ways to illustrate this is that lending has been mainly the form of supporting the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. The multilateral development banks have played a major role in the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, and the financial instrument that they have used in doing so is lending, is through loans. And now the world is reaching a consensus that the fossil fuels have to be phased out. The debate is no longer whether they should be phased out or not. The debate is how fast can they do it, and how just and equitable should they be doing it, right? And the question is, so what will happen now to all the outstanding debt that has been accumulated because they lent to fossil fuel projects? And there is a consensus that these fossil fuel projects are harmful to people and planet. So it's also the right time to call on these creditors, these lending institutions, that part of their responsibility for pushing this harmful fossil fuel energy is to start canceling this obviously illegitimate debts, because they have been used to finance these harmful projects. So this is also an important opportunity for us to call for debt cancellation, but not just on the basis of unsustainability, but as a matter of justice for all the harms that have been created because of their lending. And of course, it's not just the lending to specific harmful projects. Lending has also been the main form that they have pushed for economic conditionalities, which have left our people more impoverished and even more how do you say, vulnerable to the climate impacts now that we're facing the climate crisis. I can say like 20 years ago in the debt community, we didn't really much link the debt to the climate crisis, because what was really more obvious in terms of our experiences was the economic crisis that we were fighting. Not that the climate crisis wasn't there yet, but it wasn't the most immediate in terms of the outright physical and concrete harms our people were suffering. But now that the climate crisis has escalated to the point that the majority of people, for instance, in the Philippines, would have heard about the climate crisis, because that's how you can explain why we are having these super typhoons, unprecedented drought and heat waves, things that we were not experiencing as a people, like even 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier. So this is really very important, this work to link the debt crisis and the climate crisis, and to take advantage of this now opportunity for us to build our movements even more stronger, more robust, to link our efforts. And as probably one of the or few organizations who grew up as a debt movement, who also very early on embraced the climate justice struggle, it's very important for us to be able to create those linkages between movements who aren't quite really actually linking it or putting it together yet. So I guess because I'm speaking in behalf of COP28 Coalition, I'd like to say that in these next weeks, building up to COP, at the COP, which will be held in the UAE, we really need to have very much stronger efforts to raise the debt question. It's very encouraging to see that many climate groups and campaigners, because they're beginning to see the link, will be joining us in raising the demands that are, of course, debt specific, but also very relevant to the fights that we're having at this international arena called the COP, or the UNFCCC processes. And if I may, just for 1 or 2 minutes, I'd just like to say that one of the things that we have been witnessing is, or even more than just the last few months, is how the climate crisis has been used to justify even more lending. So we've seen, for instance, the Paris summit convened by Macron in June, which is supposed to be bringing together the international community to discuss new and innovative ways to scale up financing, not just to address development needs, but also the climate crisis. Most of the ways that they're presenting are actually not so new ways, not so innovative. They've been recycling and retweeting the same old financial responses they have had for decades, and most of them actually involve more loans. One of the things that we need to also, as activists in this arena against the World Bank and the IMF, one of the things we also have to really gear up to do a major fight is the fact that the climate crisis is being used to justify even bigger roles for the multilateral development banks and for the IMF. Bigger roles in that they're supposed to be the key institutions that will unlock trillions in climate and development finance. And guess how they're going to do that? They're going to leverage public finance, which they claim is not enough to meet all these crisis needs, but they're going to leverage that to provide incentives for the private sector to come in. And that's where the trillions are going to come from. And we know that the private sector is not going to invest trillions unless they're going to expect some return on their investments. And because the MDBs are going to play a central role, we know that a lot of this will be in the form of lending. Even lending in highly concessional terms is something that we are not advocating, because lending in very concessional terms for needs like adaptation and loss and damage really goes against the principle of acknowledging their historical responsibility and continuing responsibility for the crisis, which our people are suffering the most from and we have the least responsibility for. So perhaps, if we want to go into nuancing and policy engagement, maybe highly concessional lending can make some sense for systems like development of renewable energy systems where there's some kind of expectation of cost recovery. So yeah, we can debate it in that context, but for adaptation and loss and damage, we really cannot accept lending as this form of responses. So that's one of the things we have to gear up against, because the answer to this complicated developments now that there's the World Bank new roadmap and the IMF getting so much into climate isn't just about calls for debt cancellation. We really have to start calling for stopping lending as the main form of response to multiple crises, stopping lending, because this is just goes against what the world should be, what the international community should be engaging in or responding, which is our call for reparations. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I've got two co-facilitators with me, Gaia from Demand Climate and Yolanda from Eurodad. So what we're going to do now is just have a short Q&A to get into some of these issues more and to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to hand over to Gaia for that.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. When we decided to hold this session, we actually saw it being a workshop. And one of the ideas we had was to hear from you what you think the major demands should be and how we communicate debt and climate as a linked issue. We would like to hear from you what you're seeing in your countries, questions that you have for the panelists, ideas that you have for how we communicate this as a joint issue. So we'd love to hear from you all. So please just put up your hand and I can call on you. We have this gentleman here.
Thank you very much for all these very fruitful, all-giving contributions. I have a question to you.
I'm sorry, but we can't hear on the Zoom.
Actually, maybe if you could come to the front. Sorry about that. It's just that we have people online, so if they can hear you. So if you want to make an intervention, apologies. Come to the front. Yeah.
Thank you very much once more for your contributions, fruitful and hope-giving, motivating contributions. And I salute with big of all my heart your struggles. And I will have a question for you, because you said that 10 years ago, we didn't make the link between the debt trap and debt crisis and the climate crisis.
Not very strong.
Yeah, not very strong. Yeah, of all of us, in fact, all of us. And today we do not make, we do not analyze the links between the food sovereignty and the climate injustice. And we do not make the link between the health for everybody, right to the health, and the decolonized self-determined development. So in your opinion, I mean, just very frankly, do we have to wait another 10 years to make those links? Because in front of us, there is a very hostile predator social class, which has already done all these things in their own strategy, whatever you call it, like Great Reset for the World Economic Forum or sustainable development in their framework. So what's your idea about this, very frankly? Just, I want to know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I just have a comment.
Louder, so they can hear you online.
Okay, I'm saying that I have a comment on the presentations that I want to give in line with the debt and climate justice. For sure, I will support and say that it is in order for the legitimate debts to be cancelled so that attention of governments be diverted to climate justice. Why am I saying this? When governments are taking loans from these loaning institutions, you'll find that there is a lot of pressure on them, just as one of the panelists said, that, for example, in Kenya, you find that there is a percentage that goes to service the loans. And at any given time, the government is under pressure to pay back the loans. So attention has been diverted in servicing the loans and not on matters climate justice. And how is this one coming about? You'll find that most of the arable land that people should be cultivating are now changed into industrial agriculture, whereby we are having just cash crops like maybe tea and the likes being grown. As this is happening, they are using a lot of chemicals. Then the industries that are set for such are also emitting further greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But you'll find that the governments are just focused on how they are going to get money from all this industrial farming to help in paying back the loans. And as this is happening, you'll find that they're still contributing towards climate change, which on the other hand, people are suffering while then they are focused in what? In paying back the loans. So I will say that on the other hand, these loaning companies or the loan, they owe the people because they are the main contributors of climate change. And the principle of maybe the COSA pays it should be put in place. And it should be ongoing that those who own all the major contributors of climate change should be held responsible to pay, not the people, the government or people who did not maybe know how these loans were negotiated, because some of them are illegitimate, just as other colleagues have said. So to me, I would say that cancellation of debt is in order because they are directly proportional, maybe leading to contribution of climate change in parts of the world. Thank you.
Are there any other comments or ideas, questions from the audience? If not, maybe there'll be some questions later. So I'll let the panelists reflect on the two questions that have been asked.
So I'll address that question first. So I'm happy to share that we don't have to wait for several more years to make the linkages, because now there is this active collaboration and work among campaigners on food, land, agriculture, food sovereignty, and climate change. In fact, APMDD has one such a campaign where we're saying that, you know, because the food, land, and agricultural sector is one of the most heaviest affected by climate change impacts, it's really quite urgent to pursue many of the structural changes and policy changes we have been pursuing through our food campaigns, because they really make sense to do this very urgently because of climate impacts. And it's not just a question when we say we're working on food systems, building and strengthening food systems in light of climate impacts. We're also not just focusing on very specific food-related policies. We have to look at broader trade and economic questions that affect our food systems. So it's a question of global economic and trade relations and policies that we need to address, because unless we transform those structures and policies, we're not going to be in any way prepared for the impacts that are coming our way. So I would say that the climate crisis provides even additional layers of urgency and not just justification, reasons, urgent reasons for us to pursue many of the changes that food campaigning groups have been pursuing for years. So we need to make that connection, because certainly, as you were saying, there's still groups that are probably working on silos, just food is over here, climate is over there, and we may need to make those linkages. For the health sector, I'm afraid I'm not really in a major position to explain what's happening in that front, but I think other colleagues can also say that those linkages are being met. But I guess that's, we just need to make sure that we, as you were saying, come together to a more stronger global consensus on how these issues are tied up. Because really, the most important reason being it's the same system that has generated this crisis, this different crisis. And unless we start changing this system, we're going to have to be fighting all these different separate battles. So maybe our colleagues can add a bit more.
Yeah, so I just also wanted to share about, we had a webinar yesterday, APMDD, together with the Campaign Against Racism, debt subgroup, and one of the guests was Dr. Danny Goto from the Kampala Initiative, and he was saying by the end of the webinar, 2 mothers would have died in Uganda because, and he traced this, he was able to show how much the debt service overshadowed the budgets for health. And also, it's also a debt crisis, a climate crisis threatened country, at the same time debt burden. And so, yeah, the connections are being made. And I think also with the movements of women, organizations of women, and farmers and workers and many other things.
Yeah, and thank you for raising the issue on health. A practical example is, I would say that in many of the African countries, because based in South Africa, it portrays about struggling with the debt crisis, as well as the climate crisis combined, and then making life very difficult for everyone. So when it comes to budgets, for example, you have a government that budgets for, say, $2 trillion or 3 trillion in Kenyan shillings. But then they only can afford a quarter of that budget in terms of what they can raise as a government at any given point. And then everything else is in appropriation. We are going to borrow from the IMF, we are going to borrow from other private lenders, we are going to just find ways to finance that. So what happens is you have 3/4 of a budget, but the budget is on the roof. In real practical terms, you start to implement the budget, then you realize you can no longer raise that 3 trillion. The only money you have is half of what you actually budgeted for. So all social sectors are going to suffer. And then often we have to make some very, unprogressive trade-offs. Just the other 2 months ago, we had to make very serious trade-offs. We stopped paying civil servants for 3 months. Everybody was not paid because we have to pay the IMF so that we avoid being listed as defaulters. Those are the kind of problems that we have. By the time you are not paying civil servants, it means serious sectors like health suffer the most, because there is no way you want to invest in health as opposed to paying civil servants. So, and in a country that is very unequal, many of the African countries are very unequal in terms of service delivery, in terms of the distribution of those services. If you go in Kenya to the north, if you go in Kenya to the north, you realize that out of every 10 mothers who go to hospital for delivery, in central Kenya, at least 9 out of 10 would go to a hospital for delivery. In the northern part of Kenya, only 2 can manage because there are no those facilities there anymore. And there is that problem where we have to make hard decisions between having to invest in those social services or rather deal with the climate issue. So as I was saying earlier, even the conversation on loss and damage, I love it. In fact, for me, it's a mileage in terms of saying, hey, can we create a fund that we can then begin to give these countries to focus more deliberately on dealing with the climate crisis? But on the other end, the same countries are heavily indebted. So I'm like, you will get those funds and still give back in terms of financing the debt crisis as opposed to investing in climate solutions. So it's just a problem that we need to find ways to collectively think through, and perhaps come up with very constructive and robust strategies that can help us confront these issues. That is just the context of Kenya, but I know that many of the African countries almost face the same similar problem.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
My taking off my time. Okay. So I think because I was listening to you all, and I was transported also 10 years ago. It's been the same situation. I mean, we never left that situation, and now it's getting worse. And one of the things that it would be good to highlight is that those kind of systemic problems that the global South countries have on public services, on being able to deliver on food sovereignty, were imposed by debt cancellation. So when were imposed by debt cancellation. So when in the 90s and early 2000s, they came out with this HIPIC initiative, the debt cancellation, there was some debt cancellation for some countries, not all countries, and it was conditioned to IMF programs. I was listening to a feminist colleague from Malawi the other day, and she was reminding us how the worst food crisis in Malawi was caused by the debt cancellation, by how the IMF imposed the privatization of the grains management company in Malawi. And so all these attacks on food sovereignty, on health public services have been also imposed through schemes linked to what they call debt relief. So I think we need to be very bold in the call for unconditional debt cancellation. And I think it would be good to put those examples on the table as well, because the situation of the health system, of the food sovereignty or unsovereignty system, the food system in the global south, of education, of many other issues, have been shaped by debt restructuring programs with the private and public creditors, with an IMF program, by IMF loans, by debt cancellation. So I think making that link is very important, not to fall into the same mistake. Those debt cancellations were framed as a success by some groups, not all groups, some groups.
Some only.
Some only. And I think it's important to put that on the table today, because that is what is happening in Sri Lanka, that is what is happening today in Zambia, and that is what is going to happen probably in Ghana, that are negotiating their restructuring with their creditors. They won't get almost any debt cancellation, but they will have to implement the IMF policies. I think that is also important. And the other thing also, to open the now facilitator hat again, to open the floor for discussions on strategies, is I agree with Lily that we have, and with May, that we have been doing a lot of alliances, not just now, but for years, with groups more focused on climate, feminist movement, public sector, work, trade unions, and workers in the public sector. But we need to do more of that. I think when we were able to build a big debt movement was when those alliances were made. So I don't know, maybe ideas on how to forge those alliances in the national, in the international arenas, on how to frame, or if it's possible, it would be possible to frame like a joint campaign moment. And then my final point, and I'm now also like almost quoting you, Lily, is that we represent different organizations, different movements, and sometimes there are different strategies, even different positions in some cases. But we need to find the common points without undermining the goals. And I think that is very important, but we need to find those common grounds to build joint actions. Because if everyone goes their way, then we'll never get to where we want. So please, if you have ideas, experiences on how to work on those alliances to make this movement building better.
Yolanda, if I can just add a little thing, not just a little, but I think I want to pick up on your first point, because as I said, one of the complicated challenges today is how they're trying to use the multiple crisis situation in order to push out ideas for how to raise money. And this is a time when we are again faced with a plethora of many debt relief solutions or formulas. And this will bring us to this big debates we had during the time of HIPIC in the late 90s, which goes to show how long we have been around. And this is about balancing between some relief, which is very urgent, of course. We're not saying we need to get everything or not or nothing, but also what some of those debt relief proposals are asking for in exchange. And that is when many of the dangers come in. Like a big debate about HIPIC was that there was going to be some debt cancellation for a few countries, but there were conditionalities, and that included budget policies for countries and so on. So the big debate in the movement then was, are you going to refuse this level of relief because you're not going to get everything? Or can we not just take what we can win at this time, despite the fact that there was going to be some conditionalities? And that was a debate that was never completely resolved. And then years later, we still have movements who are saying, but we need to be able to encourage groups to fight for debt cancellation. So we need to celebrate some wins. And HIPIC was supposed to be a win because there were some cancellation efforts. And that's where we haven't completely resolved this issue, because while celebrating those wins, we also have to have our eyes wide open in terms of what cost us those wins. So I don't want to go back to HIPIC all over again, but there's a lot of lessons from that experience among movements there. What we're facing now is not so much maybe another HIPIC, but formulas like debt swaps, which is really very tricky, even trickier, I think, because it's not really, it's a very case-to-case basis, because debt swap arrangements are really very case-to-case. But we really need to forge some sort of unity in the movement about how we manage with this, because this is going to divide us in terms of responding to this very, it has already divided us, because we know that some academic institution-led debt relief initiatives have really embraced this debt swap offers and coming out with various formulas how to make this more successful, right? And not just debt swaps, but debt restructuring. We're not refusing all debt restructuring altogether, but again, like debt swaps, the devil is in the details. And then debt restructuring also comes with a lot of conditionalities. So for now, we're avoiding the debate, but we really need to have some internal confrontation of those issues so that we're able to rise to the occasion in a much more unified way. Otherwise, I think we will be losing the battle if we don't. Sorry, that was a lot of speaking. Go ahead.
I think we may have one more question online. So, sorry, were you going to say?
Yeah, it's just.
Sorry.
That's okay, but yeah, I think that I agree with you that we are not going to make like the win in just one day. It's like an accumulation of a lot of it. Like we need to achieve many small victories to achieve the big one. And this is how like we shouldn't be like to dream just to do everything in one time. We need to focus on many points to achieve them. And at the same time, in this point, the difference between us is so heavy that we have a lot of opinion, that we are thinking together to understand, because here we're not trying to show who is better or who know more, but we are trying to find the solution together, which is the most important. That to find this line, how to work together and to find what is in common, because what we have in common is more than what we don't. So this is why we're talking about working together and to find the way how to work together. Because we are fighting together, we have the same enemy, we are working for the same goal. So we need to find our way together. So that's what I want to.
Thank you. Yeah, and then I think we had a question online. I don't know if you can, Kathy. I don't know if you can speak.
If I speak, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, that's good. So, my question really is that I think all of us that have been activists a while understand the system that we're fighting. And we've seen a long history of debt in the agendas and some debt cancellation. And I wonder if people in the panel see debt cancellation as a kind of weak chink in the armor of the system that we could collectively attack, both from the north and the south, to try to bring some actual system change. Like, potentially, if many different groups began to demand debt cancellation, would that potentially bring some change to the system and then after that bring other change with it? Do people see hope in that?
One more question here. I'm not thinking if someone has something like to.
Well, it's more of a comment, and I'm not sure where it will end up. But yeah, my name is Kjetil. I'm with Norwegian Church Aid. As Liddy said, I was also part of the struggle back in the 90s and the early 2000s. And back then we had a couple of competing narratives, actually. We had the first one, and this is where my point is that we can dig down into all of those things that Liddy was mentioning and all of the various intricacies of how this debt cancellation will be given. But as civil society, we need to formulate a very clear challenge to the governments and to people that they can get on board. And we used to have, we want debt cancellation 100% by the year 2000 through a fair and transparent process. And then a little bit later, Jubilee South formulated the response, which is don't owe, won't pay, which has a lot of the climate things that you were mentioning. So I think that we have to try to find a common message that mobilizes and that can accommodate a lot of different views. So I think that is a challenge that I want to put to the panel, I guess. And then, I mean, one narrative that we do have now coming out of the meetings that is hard to hide from. But I agree, it's not very radical, is the fact that countries are spending now 50% of their budgets on debt service. And it becomes very intuitive to everyone that, okay, they can't solve all these problems then. What are we going to do about it? But then that again doesn't necessarily include the justice issue of don't owe, won't pay. So, I mean, there's, that's to me what we have to do. We should try to resolve, and we have to do it together with the climate movements and the other movements that we were talking about. So that's my challenge to that.
Okay, so I think, yeah, the panel would like to respond to those last 2 points, and then I think we might begin to wrap up. So who would like to make an intervention there? Would anyone? Who would like to respond to those points?
Yeah, I can respond to some. One, I agree that we need to mobilize ourselves in very strategic ways in order for us to speak one voice, share the same demands and the same analysis for us to be able to change the system. I imagine that if all of us globally are speaking about debt cancellation in the same language, who wouldn't listen to all of us? I remember last year I raised in one of our meetings, Ireland, I raised the question of, do we share the same analysis? Do we share the same demands? globally, even as we meet every other day to speak about debt. But we all feel that this is something that, you know, is impacting on all of us. And I'm glad that since then, I think there have been steps within civil society to begin to move in that direction. Say, okay, fine, the South, the North, all of us are facing the same problems. But how do we come together, develop shared demands, develop shared positions, as well as shared resolutions on this issue, so that we avoid there has been always what I would call the rough path or some kind of tension between the North and the South, because people feel we are not speaking the same language. But then there are very deliberate steps to move in the direction of saying, can we come together and then develop an analysis that all of us can, you know, subscribe to and move forward. So I think for me, that is very critical. Yesterday, something came up in our meeting. The conversation on debt often has been very elite, especially on borrowing, on lending. The IMF has been a very elite conversation. And elite economists also use this, you know, new liberal capitalist language to confuse everybody. And one of the things people said yesterday here was, how do we find ways to break down, unpack, and demystify this language, especially to those who suffer the most from the consequences of debt and climate, so that they begin to understand, or rather begin to connect between the issues they face at the community level and the government, the debts that these governments borrow. What is the connection? What is the intersection? For example, how do I suffer from the fact that Kenya is indebted? Very many people are unable to have that kind of connection. So, but with the time, as we continue to do a lot of political education, as we continue to do a lot of mobilization, I do think that we are building a global movement of people who understand the system that we are trying to confront. And at one point, once all of us are on the same level in terms of understanding these issues, I feel that at that point, we are also able to more systematically push for change and push for debt cancellation. I think that is what I would want to like take there.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond? No? Yeah? Again,
I know, Lady will agree with me. No, I just think that we need, of course, clarity on the positions, the analysis. That's part of our, you know, like overarching narrative. But the policy agenda is different. What is the actionable policies that we're going to fight for? You have your narrative, but for example, I think that's where the perspective of don't owe, won't pay comes in, the illegitimacy of debt itself. But we also have specific policy asks on the cancellation of specific projects that through maybe a debt audit, we established that did this and that, and we're pushing for suspension or outright cancellation, stopping payment, engaging government, pushing government to stop payment for those debts because they're patently bad, illegal, or tainted with corruption. So I think that's how I appreciate Jettel's question.
I think there won't be a single slogan to encompass everything we ask for, but we can't also have a grocery list of things for public calls, no? So I do think that debt cancellation is still one of the most important ones to raise. And, you know, especially in policy dialogues and in policy forums, they even avoid that word. They only use the word debt relief. So I think the stronger we insist on cancellation, it's really one of the things that's being asked of us today. The other thing is debt cancellation is really addressing the lenders and the creditors. We in the South have to call on our governments to stop paying for illegitimate debt, for unsustainable debt, because that's a call for our governments. We can't let our governments off the hook because governments and our elites are part of the problem of the perpetuation of this debt system, right? So that's a call we also need to strengthen in the South. But of course, it's not an answer to a Zoom question. It's not a silver bullet. It's a very important part of our struggle. As long as we're under the stranglehold of debt, we will not be able to have the space and the power to do anything with all of our other economic and climate problems because if our governments insist on paying this debt. So it's either they cancel the lenders or our government should stop paying. But it's not a silver bullet because even if we do have that debt cancellation, unless the funds are used in a strategic way to put us along the path of systemic transformation, the problem is just going to repeat itself, which is what happened after HIPIC to the countries who went through significant, 80% of their debts were canceled, significant debt cancellation. But as in the words of the IMF speaker who was sitting next to me 2 decades ago in a forum, you know, HIPIC is really designed to clean their books so that they can borrow again. So 20 years later, the same countries that availed of HIPIC are in a debt crisis. So it's not a silver bullet. It's a very necessary step, but there's many other things that we need to do after debt cancellation or even during debt cancellation. But then just also to remind us, we're also not just calling for debt cancellation. Northern governments are compelled by legally binding agreements like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to pay us climate finance, the South, because of their responsibility for climate change. So we also should start collecting on that even more vigorously because like the debt, they're evading the responsibilities for climate finance.
Great, thank you. And then I think we have one more question online and then we're going to round up. So the online question, you have the floor.
Good day, colleagues. Can you hear me? Okay. Mine is not really a question, but taking further some of the comments. First of all, I want to thank you for all the comments concerning getting the proper language to really articulate what many developing countries need. But we need to integrate the fact that some of these countries that we want their debts cancelled still want to borrow more money. So how do we integrate that into our conversation to be able to get an appropriate capture for our advocacy? Debt, our perspective is that a lot of countries are hindered from pursuing development, dealing with the issue of climate change because they are burdened by debt. If those same countries immediately want to borrow, just the reason for the debt cancellation they want, the debt relief they want, is to borrow. That means that we need to, be able to have an articulate message that deals with not only the problem of debt cancellation, but regulates future borrowing and action around that. So that is what I feel that we should integrate into our discourse, into our messages, into our perspective. It is not enough to cancel debt, but we want debt cancellation for the purpose of addressing development issues, for the purpose of being able to deal with the climate crisis, even the triple planetary crisis. And it is not possible to achieve that if further borrowing is the key agenda for developing countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to ask that because we're going to maybe move to summing up now because we're quite close on time. So maybe if the speakers could respond to that last point in your summing up. Okay, that was a brilliant session. Thank you so much. I think we covered a lot of different things, from the impacts of the debt crisis to the links between all those intricate links between climate and debt crisis and the historical roots of that. So I'm going to hand over now just to my colleague Yolanda just to close the session and then ask for some final thoughts from you guys.
Yeah, so thank you, Eva. As Eva was saying, I think the session started by a plain description of how the debt situation is worse than ever, or at least in the last 20 years, and how this is interlinked with the climate emergency. It was said also how this can also become an opportunity because of the focus on the climate emergency, and how we can use that to put the demand for debt cancellation on the table. I think the main agreement is that this is our main joint goal, which is debt cancellation unconditional of not just unsustainable, but also illegitimate debts. And I think it's a great basis for future joint work if this is the case. We also spoke about the possibilities of strategies, and one of the issues is not just stopping at linking the debt crisis with the emergency, the climate emergency, but also with food sovereignty, with the health issues, with the education and feminist demands, etc. How debt cancellation, as the speaker just now, is alone is not sufficient. We need a system transformation. The speaker just now was talking about borrowing, and I'm putting this new into the table now. We also worked a lot on responsible borrowing and lending in the past. So how social movements see borrowing and lending in a responsible way could be, and maybe that's also something that linked to the climate crisis could be interesting to revive. Lydie was saying how we cannot accept any kind of lending, not even concessional, for loss and damage and for adaptation, that concessional lending could be useful in some cases of energy transition, but that if that is also a joint goal, that is very important for the negotiations of the NCPG, the new climate finance goal, and a joint wide goal for no debt for loss and damage and no debt for adaptation would be a very strong one. Let me finish by saying that the organizations also that put this together, or some of the organizations, we're also running a campaign on debt cancellation for climate justice, that we have a statement that we are collecting supports to that statement, calling for unconditional and immediate debt cancellation, calling for the approval of legislations in the global north to protect those countries that decide in a sovereign way not to pay, so that countries don't have to go through what Argentina and other countries have gone after not paying the debts, being sued in New York or London courts, and for debt-free climate finance. That I think all of us will be doing actions around COP28. It would be great to coordinate and obviously everyone with their own specificities, their own things, but also maybe try to find some joint messages. And that we have a lot of work to do in terms of finding the nuances of the narratives and the calls, learning from the past, and learning from the past not only from the policies on debt from the past, but also from oral history and strategies, so we can build a stronger, wider, and more impactful movement and get to the point of debt repudiation or debt cancellation. Let's see what comes first, or if one leads to the other. So that was my summary. I would love to have like 1 minute from each of you to close, and then. Okay, you can start.
Just maybe to plug the Global Week of Action for Debt, Economic and Climate Justice statement will remain open. So the sign-ons will continue. It's in the debtgwa.net website in 10 languages, I think, as of this moment. So just click on and add. And also just to add that perhaps one idea that can bring different movements together is around building a reparations agenda. What does that look like? How do we move towards that and achieve that? Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't have summarized it better than you did, Yolanda. But yeah, I think that for countries in the South to be able to, be able to deal with the climate crisis to reverse some of the more serious impacts. I do think that debt cancellation is very critical in order to relieve them, or rather to provide resources for them to then focus on addressing the climate crisis, as well as investing in other very fundamental basic social services that people need. So we are up for any conversations that are going to take us in that direction, but also building on what I think Yolanda and I think what May have said, coming together and beginning to think through narratives, shaping this conversation together. I think for me, that is very critical in the direction that we all want to move towards. Thank you so much.
Yes, it's really important to be together. I'm really happy to be together here and knowing that there are a lot of people that have this feel of importance. I mean, with the relation with debt and climate change and all the social crises, all the social struggles that we have, it's really important to know together what tasks we have in the future, what is our strategy, the tactics that we have, and how to work together to achieve what we need. Because it's really clear that we only have each other. We have to be together because they are together. They are strong together. So we need to build together, to be together also. So that's what happens.
Yeah, I think one of the important insights that we get from the climate fight is that we don't have much time. And so that also, again, imbues even our struggles on the debt issue with even a lot more urgency. But one of the realities we face is that we need to build more power. The current power that we have is nowhere near enough that we need in order to actually make these transformations that we're fighting for possible. So I hope that we also not only invest a lot of time in developing what are the best strategies and tactics using our current power, but invest a lot of time in actually building more power, because we still have a long way to go and not much time left to do it. So that would be my part.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just thanking people online. We have like 50 participants left in online, but particularly thanking the translators online, Grace, Yusef, Aya, and Salma, who've been translating for the people online. Thanks, everyone. We will continue. La lucha continúa, as always.
Thank you, everyone. Special thanks to the interpreters. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lady. Yeah.